Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I'm joined by Kirk Beck. He is the author of, I have it here, Parenting the Passive Rebel and Officer Hanson Compassion in Blue. And he describes himself as an ardent defender of liberty. And it looks like he does a lot of advocacy in court for matters around that. And he also used to be in the Army Corps of Engineers, which is fun. Maybe we'll get into bridges and levees at some point, and why all of our bridges are falling down. But we welcome Kirk to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, it's great to be here, Cameron. Where are you located?
I am usually in Wilmington, Delaware, but today I'm in Hartford, Connecticut.
Very good. Well, on the opposite sides of the country. I'm out in California.
Yes, I was just on with somebody from Arizona. And Thursday morning I was on television in India. So that's how we do. We're all over the country and the world sometimes.
You learn a lot that way, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. Well, why don't we begin from the beginning? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your books?
Well, okay. 75 years ago, I was born in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I was educated in college at Rapid City. I have a degree in engineering from that school, South Dakota Tech. I worked with, before I worked for Shell, I was in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. This was at the end of the Vietnam conflict, so second lieutenants were not going in regular Army. They were put off into the reserves. So my time in service was from 72 to 80, and it was all in the reserve except for the first 6 months. And those 6 months were in Washington, D.C. area, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And I learned a tremendous amount about the United States Army and government in general. Had some very eye-opening experiences out there. Certainly not all of them negative. I had a lot of wonderful experiences there. Ended up getting a job with Shell Oil Company, and I worked in Denver for 2 years. Made a decision in my life that I wanted to be more around people and instruments. And I decided I was going to become a teacher. I've been teaching mathematics and occasionally civics over the last 30-some years. And only now here, in the last 8 years, am I really doing what I enjoy most, which is teaching people something that's very, very important, the law and liberty. I've been married to my wife for 50 years, shy 6 months. I have 3 wonderful sons, 3 grandsons, and I call Riverside, California my home now. As for the books, the first book I wrote was Parenting the Passive Rebel, an interesting situation with a student who was very passive, never caused any trouble, but it caused me a lot of heartache because I didn't see how we were doing him justice. I was running a private school at the time. And his situation was only remedied largely because we were in a private school situation. I couldn't have done what I did with him in a public school. And that's unfortunate, but public schools are hindered from a lot of effective measures. The second book I began about 8 years ago, only because my wife said, "You really need to write these stories down." I'd been telling my son about a unique police officer, someone who really believed in being compassionate towards all. He was a martial arts elitist, but his desire was to just love people. And as a police officer, he felt that didn't necessarily hinder him. The vocation could be combined with a compassionate attitude. So I put these stories together, and my wife said, "You need to put it in a book." I said, "Well, I'm not so sure this police officer is all that practical." And then by providence, I ran into Dale Brown, who runs, at that time, I think he changed the name of the company, but at that time it was Threat Management Center in Detroit. And I flew out and I spent a day with Dale Brown, and I had my eyes open. Scenario after scenario, he gave me a different take on how police officers can deal with violent situation. And what Dale basically believes, and I believe is true also, that if police officers are properly trained in disarming violent situations, they won't have to deal so often in disarming violent people. And I think what really made an impact on me were the 7 police officers from Detroit who all had 15 or more years of experience, and they all said the same thing. Why weren't we taught like this? Had we been taught like this, we would have had less shootings, we would have had less lawsuits against the city of Detroit. So those police officers gave me a sense of understanding that Dale Brown has tremendous credibility with the law enforcement agencies, and he can teach people how to deal with things in a compassionate way. So my book has been finished. It's just in the process of going to be published sometime this year. I want to say here, Cameron, that those who follow through to the end of this broadcast, there will be a free gift that I want to give everybody as a listener that has a lot of value, I think, in doing what I do.
Excellent. Well, we'll kind of start from the beginning, maybe unpacking the whole law and order and policing aspect of things. As I'm sure you're well aware, I don't think there's been any subject that's been more of a hot topic since 2020 and the George Floyd protests and through the election and all this type of thing than trying to return cities and whatnot to law and order and making people feel safe in public and all this type of thing. And between COVID vaccine requirements and various and sundry protests and all this type of thing, it's been a difficult thing to I think to be a police officer. And I guess what is your view of all of this? How do we create the perception that we have law and order in this country?
Well, I have a conversation often with my oldest son, and I try to convey to him, I'm not racist at all, but I admit to having a lack of perspective what it's like to be a minority in the United States. I'm white. I grew up in South Dakota, 98% white. Colorado, Fort Collins, Colorado, mostly white people. California is different. Hispanics are a majority out here. But I never had a perspective what it's like to be a minority and being stopped persistently just because you're the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood. It wasn't too many years ago, I went to an FBI briefing, and an African American police officer gave his story as to how he was face down in cement in front of his house because they didn't think that a black person should be in that neighborhood. And that's right here in California. So I know that personally, the more people know about the law, the more they feel less threatened by the law officer. I know this has been my case, especially when I try to pursue my right to travel in an automobile as opposed to drive a commercial vehicle. I've gone to court 6 times on this throughout my life. It was only after I used the process called the power of paper, the affidavit process, that I was successful in defending my right to travel in a safe manner and not be stopped. This type of information could go a long way to minorities because once it becomes apparent that you know what you're talking about, I'm not sure exactly how it works, But I think I'm in a computer and there's some kind of a citation there that says he knows the law. Do not stop, do not cite, do not impound. Because I've had 3 occasions since I won my court case where I've had contact with police officers in all 3 cases. One the city of Riverside, one the sheriff of Riverside, and highway patrol. All 3 cases, I was just told, have a nice day. So if minorities especially would understand how this works, it could be very helpful that they don't feel so threatened because they know the law. This is something that all Americans should know. I was in the public schools for 7 years, most of my time in private schools. And all the time that I was in private schools, I never taught what I know today. I didn't learn this until 7 or 8 years ago. I found myself in a jury pool. And the very first day, I was sitting right behind the defendant. The defendant said something, and the judge snapped at him and said, "Sir, you had an opportunity to have a lawyer. You chose not to have a lawyer. And therefore, you have to play by all the rules." The entire time that the judge is reprimanding him, he's shaking his head quite vociferously and right in front of me. And I've been in court enough times to have a pretty good idea what's going on here. Nevertheless, it wasn't until 2 days later that I found myself on the jury stand, and the judge went through his caveats. Here's this guy who is defending himself pro per against 17 felonies. Not all had to do with insurance, with real estate scam. I just did the same thing to 17 different people, I guess. So, well, when the judge got done with his caveats, he came to me right away. He said, "Juror 14, it seems to me like you have a problem. I can tell by your body language." I said, "Well, that's true." They said, "Well, explain your problem." So for the next 3 to 5 minutes, I did. And that was enough for the prosecuting attorney to want me out of there. So after a short break, we came back and I was excused. However, I'm different than most people. I came back the next day. I wanted to sit right behind the defendant and go out to lunch. I wanted to test my theory to see whether or not I was right. I turned out to be right. He didn't want an attorney to take his case. He simply wanted an attorney to sit next to him and guide him through the rules of the court to keep him out of trouble. He had gone out to lunch with the attorney. He came back. The judge asked the attorney, "Can you guys work together?" And the attorney stood up and blindsided the defendant by saying, "Your Honor, I would suggest a complete, thorough psychiatric evaluation." The defendant felt that I needed this kind of help. So he took off on his own, and that's where I found out about Jack and Margie Flynn. Because Jack and Margie Flynn were in Maine, across the country, trying to help this man defend himself against these spurious charges. The man himself felt that he was a bigger victim than any of the people that were trying to have him indicted and thrown into jail. He felt like he was a victim as well. Well, I don't know how that turned out, except, well, I know that he was found guilty. But I now had an opportunity to get to know the Flynns, and they're the ones who taught me what is called the power of paper. In the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, there are 5 rights. Most Americans can't give me but 1 or 2. Some of them will stumble over and say the right to bear arms, which isn't even in the First Amendment. But the right to petition for redress of grievances is one that we kind of gloss over. For most of my life, I always felt that's just like, well, I signed a petition and it goes over there, and I don't know what else happens to it. It's those key words at the back end. Redress of grievance. A good synonym for redress is remedy. a remedy of grievance, a way of getting justice by use of paper. Not too long after this encounter in court, I had an opportunity to test this because I got another rolling stop. I get these periodically, although I've lived here for almost 40 years. I've only gotten 5, but I guess I'm still a recidivist. If there's nobody 50 yards that way and nobody 50 yards that way, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm probably not going to stop. But there's often police officers hiding places, and they see me not stop.
I'm a minority, so I stop.
Huh. Well, I got a funny story on that. Anyway, I've ridden with police officers when they're on duty and when they're off duty. And when they're off duty, they don't stop at the stop sign. But of course, we stop when we know there's an inherent possible collision with somebody. Then I stop every time because I have a self-interest. I don't want to hurt him, and I don't want him to hurt me. So both of us come to a complete stop, and then we wait until one of us has the right of way. That's the way it's supposed to work. Anyway, I got a rolling stop. I put my affidavit, and let's stop right there and define what an affidavit is. It's simply a declaration of truth based, in my case, upon valid constitutional law, evidence, facts, and the truth. If all of those elements are in the affidavit, there's no way it can be refuted or rebutted. So I put my affidavit to the deputy sheriff I went and had the affidavit notarized by my bank notary, and a notary is an officer of the court. So the affidavit is a legal document that can be taken into the courtroom, and unless it's refuted, it can stand as evidence in any court in America. So I sent the deputy sheriff a letter, first of all, because my mentor said, hey, treat people the way you want to be treated. Just in the way of a letter, explain what you're doing wrong. They will never recant, but you should still do what is right. After 30 days, I changed the letter into an affidavit, duly sworn under oath, that what the police officer did was a violation of due process. And I spelled out to him exactly why he had the responsibility to answer. And secondly, what would happen if he didn't answer. That everything in the affidavit could be used against him in any court in America. And one of the objects of my affidavit was to point out that technically he made a false arrest. I'm going to court. I've been in court 4 or 5 times before, and I never win. I walk into court that day with a witness. Always take a witness with you. And the deputy walked in. He gave something to the judge, and a few minutes later, my name was being called out, and he said, Mr. Beck, your case has been dropped. You may leave. So I got the minute order from the clerk. Never leave the court without getting the minute order. Make sure it's in writing what happened. So, but I walked out, and I'm thinking, all my life, I've always felt there was something about law that made more sense than what I've experienced. Because when I got my first ticket many years earlier in Colorado, it was a rolling stop at 2 o'clock in the morning. There's nobody around. And I started thinking even way back then, wait a minute, I'm not hurting anybody. And the money is going to go to the people writing the ticket, government. It's not going to go to some person who's a victim of traffic violations, collisions on the street. It's going to go to the group of people that are writing the ticket. This sounded like a conflict of interest to me. But decades went by before I finally had an answer to the situation. The situation is There's due process violations on almost every traffic stop. And when you bring these violations of the real law before the court, and you deal with the question of jurisdiction, you're in a situation where you can gain victory. And it doesn't matter what color you are. You can be brown, you can be black, you can be any color. If you know the law is blind. If you don't know the law, believe me, you can find yourself in a pickle if you're a minority in certain places. So that, in a nutshell, is how it started. It started with traffic, but I've expanded upon that. I consider 5 victories that I've had. The traffic was kindergarten rule. It's just, traffic is, it's not even really a court. It's kind of an administrative hearing. But if you turn it into a common law situation, you can still walk out of there, as I did, without having to pay a fine. I have since dealt with 2 regarding COVID. We had a situation where at Best Buy, I was told I had to wear a mask in order to get into the store. And I said, well, it's not a law. I said, oh, yes, it's a law. No, it's not a law. It's a mandate from our governor. And the governor doesn't make laws. He can make suggestions. He can appeal to us for certain actions, but I'm not going to wear a mask to come into your store. Well, then you're not coming into the store. All right, I'm not. But I put an affidavit together. I spelled out exactly what was going on and my right to enter their store, since they're open to the public, without having to wear a mask. And 3 months later, I ended up in court, and Best Buy had to send a representative in. Now, the only thing I'm trying to get here is just access into the store. I'm not suing them for a boatload of money. I just want this nonsense to stop. They had to show up. I tell people, I learn law by doing law. And I always live under the code, do no harm to anyone. If I'm not harming anyone and I'm just trying to get justice, I'm at least going to learn law, if not actually win. In this case, I learned some law. See, I'd been taught that if you're going to raise any kind of constitutional issue in a courtroom, you need to do that by way of a pre-trial motion. A lot of patriots will go into court, they'll start arguing the Constitution. Sometimes they'll get slammed. The judge might even put them in jail. They walk away from that and you think, my God, what's happened to this country? We turned into a tyrannical nation. Well, in actuality, the judge is only operating on what he's been operating under for maybe 2-3 decades, because no American's coming in there and dealing with what Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence. Cameron, one of the most succinct statements in the entire Declaration of Independence goes like this. He, speaking of the king, has combined with others, speaking of Parliament and the colonial governors, he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Constitution is not the United States Constitution, which came in 1787, 11 years later. Jefferson is talking about the common law of England. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our law, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Pretended legislation, or something called the color of law, is what's going on throughout the United States. As the Supreme Court has told us on several occasions, a statute that is not constitutional is not only not law, but it is also a statute that should not be obeyed by the American citizen. The Supreme Court is telling us, don't obey unconstitutional law or statutes. And that's what I'm teaching people to do. Why are you obeying unconstitutional statutes? You're just going to get more of them and more of them until your life is restricted more and more, and it's more and more difficult for you to feed your family because taxes are going to go higher. There's going to be a cost of living increase that is not going to be able to keep up with inflation because we have not stood our ground. We have been apathetic. We certainly haven't been taught by the public school system how to stand against evil. And the end result is more loss of freedom. But when you understand the question of jurisdiction and you learn how to deal with it in the courtroom, you can have a fresh breeze of freedom and liberty come across your chest because I feel like I live in the greatest country in the world. I know there are many things wrong with it, but it's mostly because the American people are ignorant of what their responsibilities are. They'll complain about, oh, you're violating my right. Well, what about your responsibility, sir? You have a responsibility to know the Constitution of the United States. You have a responsibility to know how to defend yourself. This is not rocket science. This is not brain surgery. This is pretty simple stuff, but it takes a little bit of work, and that's what I'm doing. I help people here, I help some people there, and I just tell people, study to show yourself approved. You need to be a workman who's not ashamed. You can go into court, and you can be very tactful, respectful, firm with the judge.
I mean, that's all. I mean, that's a very fascinating thing. You remind me of some of the sovereign citizen types I used to hang out with when I worked in the Constitution Party, and things along those lines. So I gather it's your view we don't have a lot of freedom and liberty these days.
We have much less than we used to have, and it is definitely possible. As I tell people, I can defend myself. I can't help you be free unless you want to learn. You can't be timid. You have to learn that this is a government of the people. The Constitution begins with we the people, not they the elected. Too many, and I've been there myself over the years, you work really hard in an election, you spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and you end up losing. Sometimes you win, you end up, oh my gosh, this guy was no better than the one we had. What I've found is it's much more effective for the people to simply know what the law is and then keep government inside its box. We had a assemblywoman who sponsored a bill. The bill would have made it more difficult for a pastor or a priest to just engage in a dialogue with someone about sexual dysphoria. Wait, nobody's forcing this person in to talk about it, coming on their own free will, and a pastor or priest gives a biblical discussion about sexual dysphoria. Well, I know somewhere down the road in the past, somebody took that information and it hurt them so badly that they probably did commit suicide. I'm not saying that never happened, but you should never pass laws based upon the exception. You pass laws based upon what is best for the general public.
Certainly.
I wrote my assemblywoman a letter and explained what she was doing wrong, inhibiting the free speech of a human being. I don't do this kind of counseling, but there are pastors, priests, and professional psychologists who do. And this law, this statute, had the intent to turn that conversation, those conversations, into felony. So I'm sure a lot of people sent in letters. I sent in a letter followed by an affidavit. That law, that statute had been passed by the Assembly in California. It had passed by the Senate. Our governor, Jerry Brown, was ready to sign it. And the affidavits hit the people. The letters came in, and the statute was pulled. It was never put into law. What was interesting to me was that 6 months later, my assemblywoman didn't even sponsor a resolution, which a resolution is just a suggestion. She didn't even sponsor the resolution for the same kind of action towards counselors and pastors and priests. Yeah, I had gone into her office specifically. If I see the potential for a problem with someone, then I arrange for a meeting and I go in and talk to them. The assemblywoman had only been in office for 6 months. I went in and I said to her, according to the Declaration of Independence, what is the purpose of government? And Cameron, they almost invariably say to protect the people. Well, my response, and I had witnesses with me, I said, well, at 2 o'clock in the morning, if somebody's breaking into my house, I don't think it's going to be too effective for me to call 911. It's probably going to take too long for them to get there, and I could be dead or mugged by then. My responsibility is to protect myself. But according to the Declaration of Independence, after those most cherished words, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, comes this sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Assemblywoman, your responsibility is to secure my rights. Pass some laws up there that protect my right so that people can't pollute, they can't have too much noise in the neighborhood, those kind of laws to protect our rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Please go up there and pass some good laws like that. Don't pass laws that infringe upon the rights of the people. So,
I think word that we were all so civically active as you are. When I worked in the state senate, I took calls from concerned citizens like you all day, every day. And I've had so many similar conversations as you have. But I think part of the problem is there's a big disagreement on what those rights are and how we define them. And I think that's where a lot of the political discussion begins.
absolutely.
Especially when you get into social issues and identity politics.
Yeah. Well, the common law is do no harm. Don't do harm to other people. Don't steal from them. Bastiat wrote the law in 1850, and he wrote a book, very small book, but the word that he used over and over again was plunder. Plunder. How people use government in order to get something from those people by way of tax credits, or as way subsidies. Somebody's paying for all that. There's a movement of money from one person to another. The question is it according to the common law? Or are you coming up with a new method by which you can enrich yourself? It's all over the place, and both political parties
But
are.
one could argue if government wants more of something for the good of the people, lowering costs or whatever have you, then those subsidies and things can be productive. This is true in oil, agriculture, healthcare.
Oil's an interesting one.
9 billion per annum.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in Alaska, they have a kind of like an income that comes to the people. Um, the oil companies come in, they take the resources out of the state, and the money that they pay to the state is returned to the people.
Yes, of course.
But in most states, that's not the case.
But I don't
Individuals,
think anyone would say we should stop subsidizing agricultural products because it would cause the cost of food to increase unnecessarily. Well, no, we're not writing checks to people, but I think we also appreciate stable food prices. And we know this because they haven't been stable the last several years, and Lord knows people have complained about it.
we've never had true free markets in America. That's part of the problem. And we probably never will. But as Bastiat points out, it's a responsibility of the people to drive out as much plunder as possible. Wherever it is, do your best to try to alleviate or at least reduce it. Because if more and more people start from the perception that if I can use the law in order to improve my status, improve my substance, more and more people will fall prey to that. It's a responsibility of the people. We'll discuss each one of them. We'll discuss it in depth, not in this program, of course, but that's the purpose. We come together and we decide what is the most agreeable situation for the general public, not specific people. I come from South Dakota, which is a farming state. Farmers, you have to spend a lot of time talking to farmers, and you'll find out a lot of them don't like the subsidies. They end up being used against them, not for them. But that's a whole different topic.
Right.
Situations I've worked with were obvious situations where liberties were being infringed upon.
Yeah, I noticed one of the things that you know, you had mentioned that you were working on was an action against the State Attorney General of California.
The Attorney General?
I wasn't quite sure on the details of the case. Let me look at the note. Let me get clear before I ask the question. Yes, you had mentioned in your note that you said you were leading the charge in his local California county to go after the state attorney general for his errant actions, and I wanted to ask about it.
Yes.
Yes. Why don't you
Well,
tell us a little bit about that?
about 8 years ago, an undercover journalist broke the story that Planned Parenthood was harvesting baby organs for sale. The gentleman who did it, David Daleiden, had his home raided by the Attorney General, who at that time was Kamala Harris.
Hmm.
He was simply doing undercover journalism, totally legal. But several states, several blue states, had passed laws that were trying to stop this kind of journalism. So not only was his house raided, but he became subject to full counts of indictments on felony for simply doing what journalists have done for many, 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 many years, except now we have a little better technology. And Daleiden went into a public place, had hidden microphone and camera, and got Planned Parenthood talking about how much money they raise in order by simply harvesting baby hearts, livers, different organs, and then selling them on the market. All of this is felonious activity. The Planned Parenthood, other than having a few states like Texas say, no more money from us, nobody's gone to jail for doing this. But David Daleiden been on the hook for 7 years fighting for his freedom, subject to multi-million-dollar lawsuits. He's just a little guy. Fortunately, a lot of Americans have come alongside and said, hey, we'll help you with your legal fees. Okay. The Ninth Appellate Court, not known as a bastion of conservatism, took a look at an Oregon law that was essentially the same as the California law and ruled unconstitutional. There's no reason for our present Attorney General to be continuing to proceed to criminalize David Daleiden on something that's already been stated by the appellate court to be unconstitutional. So here's an aspect of the common law. You hear all this time, you don't have any standing. You don't have standing. In common law, you come after me, my brothers can come after you. And if you come after my brother, I can come after you. Anybody who's being attacked wrongly by the government, the rest of us have a responsibility to stand with them. So David Daleiden is being attacked. My responsibility is to come to his aid as best I can. The affidavit, which has not yet, I want to back up. I already sent the Attorney General an affidavit on David Daleiden. However, now the Attorney General has gotten himself into even more trouble. So this time, I'm trying to get more of my American friends to join me in an affidavit, and then we will attempt to bring the Attorney General of the state of California into small claims court in Riverside. Now, nobody's done this before, but then nobody tried to get Best Buy into court either, and they had to show up. So we do what we believe is right. This Attorney General is acting, in my opinion, feloniously against David Daleiden. So we're going to go into it and we're going to stand with him. Now, what has he done recently? The new administration has sent our Attorney General a letter pointing out to him that if you continue to proceed with the sanctuary status for the state of California in clear violation against United States immigration laws, which are constitutional, you, the Attorney General, are subject to not only civil, but also criminal action. Now, my Attorney General needs to be obeying the law. My responsibility is to come alongside those who are being hurt by his misconduct and try to hold him accountable to his oath of office. And that's the whole purpose of the affidavit. You voluntarily took an oath to defend and support the Constitution of the United States, and you're not doing that. As a matter of fact, you're willfully violating it. And we, the people, need to hold you accountable. So come on down here to Riverside, and maybe you can get on the internet and come down. I'll accept that. But nevertheless, you have to be accountable to the people for your actions. You're an elected official. You are not a leader. You are a public servant. And public servants need to listen to their masters. And we're telling you, you're violating the law. And that's where it really gets good, is when the person is actually violating federal laws, he has nothing to stand on. We had a chief medical officer out here who was going around telling all the restaurants they had to close down or he's going to fine them. Our sheriff said, no, I'm not going to enforce unconstitutional mandates from the governor. but the chief medical officer was. So we got information that there's a code of federal regulations specifically states that in order to have these kind of mandates, you have to have something called committees. There's a special name to them. The committee comes together and they look at the information and determine whether or not there's enough information in order to actually mandate this kind of action. It has to be made up of people who have no monetary interest in the outcome. These are review boards. That's what the code says. We never did that in Riverside County. He has no lawful authority to go around and tell restaurants to close their doors. We put the information in a letter and explained to him what he did wrong. He did nothing. We sent him an affidavit. He did nothing. The Flynn said, well, this is not unusual. Now you just have to step up. Put your affidavit in an envelope with another affidavit to the supervisor in the county. In our county, we have 5. So all 5 of them got an affidavit specifying, hey, you've got a hireling down here who's violating federal law. You need to do something about him, otherwise you're culpable. I never have had a phone call from my supervisor, except that time. And he was not happy when he called me. Nevertheless, I said, he's the problem, not me. Now you've got the problem because of him. Well, don't bark at me, deal with him. 4 months later, that guy was gone. He took his pension and moved to Australia. But he doesn't have a job here anymore. He was terminated. The affidavit, I would never say my affidavit did it. Matter of fact, I often tell people, when you win, they'll never tell you why. You'll never see it in print. Oh, he properly raised the question of jurisdiction. They're not going to say that. They're just going to say the case was dropped. It was dismissed. Until we have a far greater understanding of the law by a far greater number of people, but certainly much, 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 much less than the number of people needed to win an election. In Riverside, I say if I have 30 people doing what I'm doing, we'll be very, very effective.
Well, yes, I guess that's today in government accountability and making people, keeping government officials accountable to the people is always a fascinating thing. Well, we're coming close to the end, so why don't you tell us where we can keep up with you online and where we can buy your books at?
Well, as I said, the Officer Hansen book has not yet been published. The book on parenting the passive rebel is available on Amazon. I have a free gift. Your viewers can go to affidavitsecrets.com/Cameron. That's affidavit, that's singular, secrets, plural.com/Cameron. And what they'll get is the template for the affidavit. They will see the first paragraph and the last paragraph. The template will have a body, but the body depends upon the situation. It changes for every situation that comes along, whether it's a traffic case or there's a government official that's violating the Constitution. It's always different. But the first paragraph spells out the fact that they must answer. They have a constitutional requirement to answer. You send them a letter, they don't have to answer that. You send them an affidavit, they have a requirement to answer it, especially when you put in the last paragraph, failure to rebut this affidavit, all the contents thereof may be used against you in any court in America. I don't send affidavits to agencies. I send affidavits to the guy at the top of the agency that's causing trouble. He may not even know what's going on in my county. But when he gets an affidavit with his name on it, he's going to be interested in what is this all about. So when you go to that link, you'll have the opportunity to get the template. You'll also be able to get what comes out an update on my book. My book has 57 chapters, and I did an executive summary of each of the chapters. So as time goes on, you're getting a good flow for what the book's all about. The book is full of choice, wonderful experiences that I've had dealing with both the good cops and the bad cops. And as one man said, if you read my book, because he was an editor, and he made a reference after it, said, if you read this book, you're going to have wonderful opportunities to become very educated. My hero goes off to the Kuwait, or the Iraqi War. There's lots of history in it. There's a whole chapter on the battle for Haditha Dam, and that was the only major conflict of the Iraqi War. So there's a lot of good history in the book, and you can kind of become aware of it as you move through reading the executive summary. Sometime this year, the book will be published.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast and telling us all about this. It is definitely a bit of an interesting thing, but that's the type of thing we do here. We have interesting conversations. So thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast, and just really thank you for sharing, and we'll look forward to your new book.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for having me today.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.